I'm very pleased to welcome you to our virtual Sussex meeting. This time last year, the Philological Society meeting was in Glasgow, and people were actually in Glasgow. The Sussex people are in Sussex, but the rest of us are everywhere. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Justyna Robinson, who will be the chair for this panel of early career researchers. As colleagues may know, the November meeting has become a tradition really for us to travel to other places. We've been to Manchester and to Sheffield, for example, Newcastle, a number of places where we feature early career researchers at this particular meeting. So we've continued this tradition, and I think I'll just hand over to Justyna and welcome her and the panel. So over to you, Justyna.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and great thanks go to Philological Society for accepting the proposal of running the remote event at University of Sussex. So welcome to the Approaches to Lexical Variation event at Sussex. If you came to Sussex, you would have a chance to have a look at our beautiful campus, which is situated in the South Downs, just outside Brighton. And that's the aerial map of the campus. As you enter the campus, you would notice some quite fascinating buildings. So let me just put this is a slideshow. Okay, so for instance, you would see a lot of arches around. The architect who was asked to find a vision for the new campus built just after the used ancient ruins, ancient Roman ruins as an inspiration for the campus. So there are a lot of ancient Roman elements in the architecture, lots of nice arches, but also ruins in a way. If you look at the top, at this particular building with those two triangles in a way collapsed, it shows some kind of disruption in this beautiful symmetric environment. And we hope that will bring some disruption today to the way of thinking about lexical variation. One particular building that I wanted to show you as well, if you come to Sussex University on the main courtyard, you'll have this view. It's the view of the library. I wonder if any people who don't know answer to this question would guess what the inspiration for that building was. Any ideas? Okay, so I will give you the answer. So the inspiration for that particular building was an open book. As you see the stairs here, maybe that's not particularly sharp photo. The stairs represent the pages of the book that kind of opens and has got this curvature at the top. So what is the book that we're opening today? Today we're opening the book of lexes, words, meanings, senses, lexical variation, language change, which is the area in linguistics which has got deep traditions at the University of Sussex. So let me just give credit to people who are responsible for this tradition. Those people have been working either at the University of Sussex or Brighton, which are literally across one big A road. And I want to mention names here of lexicographers like Beryl Sue Atkins. I would like to mention Mike Grundle, who currently is the editor-in-chief of Macmillan Dictionary. I would like to mention Adam Kilgarith, who then co-developed the sketch engine, a corpus interface that some of you might have used. I would like to mention my lovely colleagues, especially Professor Lynn Murphy, who's been working on everything lexical, but her recent book looks at lexis variation between British and American English. This is her kind of recent older publication on lexical meaning. She also runs a blog, which is in one of the top linguistic blogs, separated by common language. If you had chance to subscribe. And also we have several labs across the campus working with text analysis. For instance, a text analytics group who has worked with all sorts of people who are interested in words and senses, as presented on that slide. So I wanted to kind of give some overview of questions that those people have been asking so far and what state of lexical variation we are entering as they are now being the senior academics. So for instance, on that slide, I'm here presenting some summaries of those of the thinking about lexical variation through titles of some memorable publications of the people I've mentioned. For example, Lynn Murphy asks the question, what do we talk about when we talk about synonyms? Ask the question, and she refers us to a thesaurus. So go to thesaurus when you want to look at synonyms and word senses. But then Sue Atkins says, well, start where the dictionary stop. So maybe let's look at the corpus lexicography. Then at some paper, I was dissatisfied with how lexis was discussed by some disciplines. And I say, why should social linguists bother with semantics? To which Michael Rundle in some other paper metaphorically says, well, it works in practice, but will it work in theory? That's another question. To summarize this debate, one of the most quoted papers of Adam Kilgarriff is, I don't believe in word senses. So in this environment of the long tradition, yet a lot of tension, as you see as well, in this tradition, new researchers, especially the ones that I'm going to introduce in a minute, try to make meaningful steps, produce meaningful research, and add to the knowledge. So as you can see, they have dealt with quite a challenge. Why I'm saying that they have dealt with quite a challenge, because all of the speakers who are going to speak today are in a very similar stage in career. They all submitted their PhD dissertations and they are awaiting Viva. This is entirely coincidental, but if this is not the time to give them confidence and support, I don't know which other time is better. So I would like to introduce Rhys Sandow, who will talk about onomasiology, semasiology, and the social aspects of lexical variation and change in Cornwall. Then Sandra Young will take us through the journey of corpus lexicographic approach to lexical variation in the biological nomenclature. And then finally, Mary Edward, also from Brighton University, will talk about lexical variation in sign language across the close linguistic comparison of two Ghanaian sign languages. So I don't know how in the welcoming will work on Zoom, but on behalf of everybody and those who already have microphones on, I just want to give a warm welcome to our lovely presenters. The plan of action for today is that each of them will speak for about 25 minutes. And then after an hour and a half, we'll have opportunity to ask questions and have a discussion about ways forward. So I'm giving my floor now to Rhys, who has been working closely with me actually for the past few years. He was our graduate at Sussex when he did his undergraduate level. Then he went to UCL to do his master's degree. Came to us to Sussex to do his PhD. He's been an exemplary student from the day one. During his undergraduate studies, he won a scholarship from internal Sussex scholarship to carry out paid research over the summer, which even across the Sussex, he won the competition among other researchers as producing the best outcomes of that research event, which he then presented to UK Parliament. He was, so it gives me a great pleasure. I could talk and talk and talk about Rhys, as well as Sandra and Mary, because I know all of them very well. They are not only colleagues, but really good friends. So, but I will just get quiet now because you came here to listen to them, not to myself. So warm welcome to all of them, but especially Rhys now, who is taking the floor from me.
Thank you very much, Justyna, for introducing me there and for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you to Sandra and the Philological Society more generally as well. So the title of my talk today is Onomasiology, Semasiology and the Social Aspects of Lexical Variation and Change. So there's quite a lot that I want to try and get through today in terms of talking about my PhD research and some of the key findings that have come about from that research. Just a little bit sort of about me and my perspective, because I know that the three people on this panel, we're all coming at lexical variation from very different perspectives. So I just wanted to mention exactly where it is. The three of us on this panel are coming at this topic of lexical variation from very different perspectives. So I wanted just to outline exactly where it is that I'm coming from and my perspective, my research background. Fundamentally, I'm a sociolinguist. And I take both quantitative and qualitative approaches to sociolinguistic research. So I look at linguistic usage, and I also look at perception and the way people evaluate the use of language. And as is fitting for today's workshop topic, I focus on lexical variation. Okay, and specifically, I look at lexical variation in Cornwall. So this is the Anglo-Cornish dialect. This is distinct from the Cornish language, which is Canoic. That's not my research. I look at the variety of English spoken in Cornwall, which is the Anglo-Cornish dialect. Okay, so I thought I'd start this presentation by talking about what we already know about lexis. And then I can talk about how my research fits into this and how we can sort of move forward with sociolinguistic approaches to lexical variation. So what we really know about lexical variation is that there's a strong association with lexical usage or lexical variation and geographical space. And this has been shown in dialectology through dialect maps and looking at isogloss boundaries. So we see that lexis is a very good diagnostic for geographical variation. And there's a growing limited body of research which links lexical usage to social space. So we're looking at categories here such as age, gender, and social class. And we've got some people in the audience today who've conducted research in this manner, Justyna being one of them. Okay. And we also know from the research in cognitive sociolinguistics that lexis can simultaneously shed light on cognitive and social factors, which are relevant in the context of language variation and change. Additionally, as well as being full of semantic meaning, lexical items are also, or can be also, heavily laden with social meaning, and that's something that we'll mention later on in this presentation. Okay, so what I really want to do is showcase the value that lexis can have on our understanding of sort of processes of sociolinguistic change. So the best way to do that is just to discuss the research. So focusing on my study here. So as I mentioned at the top of this presentation, I'm looking at the Anglo-Cornish dialect, and I'm looking at both onomasiology and semasiology. And I'll be dealing with these separately today and looking at some of the challenges we have to overcome to study both of these areas of lexical variation and some of the key findings that come out from the study as well. Okay, so in my study, I interviewed 80 speakers from the towns of Camborne and Redruth, which are two towns in just west of centre Cornwall. And the sample of speakers were balanced for age, gender, and socioeconomic class, as is conventional in variation in sociolinguistics. Additionally, I, from a pilot study that I did, identified that Cornish identity was a really important factor in lexical usage within Cornwall. And in order to quantify this identity, I used an identity questionnaire. Okay. And the Cornish identity is really complicated, really nuanced. In fact, I have a whole chapter on it in my thesis. But for the purposes of this presentation, I think it's just important to note that Cornish people famously have a very, very proud sense of local identity. Okay, so some obstacles that we face when we're looking at lexical variation from a sociolinguistic perspective are very much related. So two of the main ones I identify here are the issue of defining what a variable is, and also in light of this, in light of our answer to question 1 here of defining the variable, we have the issue of what methodologies can we use to investigate lexical variation. And these are very different questions when we apply them to onomasiology and to semasiology. And I'll be talking through sort of my resolutions or the things that I think work in the rest of this presentation. Okay, so defining the sociolinguistic variable. Now this is how sociolinguistic variables are typically considered. And Sally Tagliamonte puts it as a sociolinguistic variable is 2 or more ways of saying the same thing. Now, this could also be a definition of synonymy. Okay, we could also define synonymy in the same way. However, we run into problems because there's no such thing as absolute synonymy. Right? There's always some kind of variation, be that semantic, social, connotative, some kind of variation between words which are purported to be synonyms. So how do we deal with this if they're not actually the same way of saying the same thing? Okay. To define a logical variable, there are 2 points that I think are really important to consider. And the first one of which is that variance of a given variable could be substituted for another variant without changing the truth conditions of an utterance. And secondly, variants of an onomasological variable are free to vary in the social or stylistic dimension. Okay, and as I mentioned just a moment ago, natural language abhors absolute synonymy, as Alan Cruz famously said. So how does this work if we're interested in substituting words where truth conditions aren't being altered? How does that work? Well, one of the ways in which synonyms can relate is that they share some kind of semantic overlap, right? So if we imagine this Venn diagram on the right hand side here, what we're really looking to do is isolate this center ground, and one of the ways that we can do that is methodologically, which I'll move on to in a moment. So really, when we're looking at onomasological variation, what we need to be considering is the conceptual space that is occupied by multiple variants, so multiple words. And just quickly, an example of an onomasological variable would be the variable would be the concept, such as sofa, and the variant is the word, so sofa, couch, or settee. Okay. In this study, I looked at 4 onomasological variables, which have specific Anglo-Cornish realizations. So the variables are lunchbox, walk, woman, and tourist, which can be realized in a variety of ways. So for lunchbox, we've got a range of standard English variants, as well as the Anglo-Cornish cribbox, crib, croused, crousebox, and croustin. For walk, the Anglo-Cornish variant is stank. For woman, it's maid, and for tourist, it's emmet. Okay, but for purposes of this presentation, at least, I'm just going to consider the variances either Anglo-Cornish or not. Okay, rather than looking at the nuance of the different Anglo-Cornish realizations. So, methodology when it comes to onomasiology. Now, my aim when I was thinking about methodology for this study were twofold. First of all, I wanted to develop a methodology that was consistent with my definition or operationalization of the onomasological variable. So that's what we saw a few slides ago with the definitions of the variable. But I also really wanted to ensure that I enabled an analysis of variation in both social and stylistic dimensions. So this suggests that we're probably going to need more than one type of methodology to account for style. Okay, so what I did, I came up with the spot the difference tasks, which have been used in sociophonetic research and by some sign language researchers at DCAL in London. And so what I did is I got participants to complete these tasks. I told them that the focus of the task was on problem solving, and I used a watch to time them in order to to create a sense of urgency and competitiveness, which the idea was that would limit the monitoring of language. So the idea was that this was a casual speech style where attention to speech is limited. Okay, and in this example here, we can see that we've got an example of a lunchbox, which is one of the variables, and then we've got an example of a woman, which is another one of the variables. Okay, and there were 5 of these tasks where each of the variables were included in 2 of them. This contrasts with a careful elicitation procedure, which is a naming task, where I tell participants that in this task, I'm interested in the word that you use. So this increases the attention paid to speech, and particularly to word usage. Okay. So now moving on to defining the variable when it comes to semasiology. And for this, I don't really have any innovation of my own. Broadly, I use the definition provided by Justyna in her own PhD back in 2010. So she defines a semasiological variable as a lexeme which can be realized in different senses. Interestingly, she puts this as, unlike the traditional definition of a sociolinguistic variable, when it comes to semasiology, we're looking at not different ways of saying the same thing, but the same way of saying different things. So the example would be that the variable could be the word, such as sick, and variants of the meanings, such as unwell, evil, or good. And in the context of this research, I'm looking at 2 semasiological variables, which incidentally are actually variants of the onomasiological variables that we looked at earlier. So these are emit and made. Emit has 2 senses in Anglo-Cornish dialect, both of which can be considered to be Anglo-Cornish, whereas made has 2 senses, one of which can be considered Anglo-Cornish, which is woman, and then it also has a standard sort of non-local sense, which is female servant or attendant. Okay, and methodology. So what methodologies can I use which are consistent with this definition of a semasiological variable? Well, again, I'm taking the lead from Justyna's own PhD. So what she did, she came up with a sort of 2-part question-answer framework. So first of all, she asked who or what is a target word, which was typically an adjective in Justyna's research. Participants would respond with a referent, and then the follow-up question is why is the referent the adjective? And then the following response would be because it is, and then they would come up with the sense of the word. So when this is applied to a particular word such as sick, it would look something like this. So who or what is sick? My friend Frankie. Why is Frankie sick? Because they're so cool. When this applies to nouns, it's slightly different and it's a bit more direct. So when I initially ask who or what is the noun, participants respond with the reference, but also the sense. That's sort of how meaning works when it comes to nouns. So it skips out, I guess, part of this elicitation procedure. So in a way that makes this task a little bit more direct when it's applied to nouns. And I think there's hopefully a lot more that can be developed in terms of eliciting semasiological variation in a casual style, but this is sort of the best that we have at the moment. So when this is applied to one of the words that I'm looking at in this study, it could be something like this. So who or what is an emit? And the answer could be a person on holiday in Cornwall. Okay, so starting off with the usage data that we elicited, well, I elicited through this technique, starting off with the semasiological variation of emit. I focus specifically on the sense of ant here because 79 of the 80 speakers used emit tourist. So there's not a lot of social analysis I can do there, but 18 speakers used the ant sense. Okay, and it did display social variation. This variation wasn't random, it was structured in that this traditional sense was used much more by older speakers. Okay, so this is highly significant. And it was also used to a greater extent by speakers with a high strength of Cornish identity, which was quantified on an identity questionnaire. But there were no overall patterns of no statistically significant patterns in terms of socioeconomic class or gender. Okay, and we can see the interaction between some social categories here in this decision tree. So what we can see is the group most likely to use emit in the ant sense are older speakers. Within the sense of older speakers, there's a socioeconomic class effect here, which we didn't see in the overall sample, but we do see specifically within the older speakers. So we see that middle class speakers who are older are more likely to use this conservative sense than their working class counterparts. And then there's even further variation, whereby we see that speakers with a high sense or strong sense of Cornish identity are more likely to use this sense than their counterparts with a low identity questionnaire score. So what we can see here really is that semasiological usage is highly structured. There's a lot of nuanced variation here. Okay, so coming on to maid. So I look at the Anglo-Cornish sense here, which is woman. Now, overall, there was no variation that was statistically significant in terms of overall usage. However, what I did is I used the who, what elicitation prompts twice, and I coded for whether or not the responses were in the first response or the second response. And so dealing just with the first response here, we do see statistically significant variation with older speakers using the local sense more. And similarly with emit, we also see that speakers with a high identity questionnaire score use this, this local sense more than those with a low identity questionnaire score. And again, overall, there's no socioeconomic class or gender effect. Okay, we can see there's some more interesting sort of interactions between social groups in this decision tree. So what we can see is that older speakers are more likely to use the woman sense, whereas younger speakers are more likely to use the female servant or attendant sense. And this change is actually led by speakers with a low identity questionnaire score. So younger speakers with a weak Cornish identity are more likely to use a supralocal sense of this word rather than the local sense. Okay. So this has some interesting implications if we look at it from the perspective of cognitive sociolinguistics and specifically diachronic prototype semantics. So Gilquin argues that the more prototypical senses of words are produced in earlier elicitation tasks rather than the non-prototypical senses, which would typically occur in subsequent repetitions of the task. So what we see is that for older speakers, maid woman is the prototypical sense because this was the sense that older speakers typically used first, while for younger speakers, it was maid, female servant or attendant, which was the prototypical sense, as that was the sense used in the first elicitation prompt by younger speakers. So these elicitation tasks that Justyna has developed and I've subsequently used enables this change in progress to be observed. So we can not only observe social variation, but we can also observe changes in the cognitive restructuring of listeners' categories. Okay, so that's just an example of what we can do with semasiological variation. And then moving on to social variation of the onomasiological variables. So as I said, at the beginning, we're looking at 4. 3 of these 4 exhibit an age effect, with older speakers being more likely to use these words than younger speakers. And all of these investigated words exhibit an effect with identity questionnaire score. Now, the exception to the age effect is emit, and this has a really sort of interesting explanation actually to do with the word social meaning, but we're not really going to have too much time to be able to go into that today. Okay, then looking at stylistic variation. So if you'll remember, we the speakers were asked to do 2 tasks, which were elicitation procedures for the onomasiological variables. So we had the spot of difference task, which elicited a casual speech, and we had a naming task, which elicited a careful speech style. So what we can see here is that there's really clear stylistic variation for all 4 variables. And what we see, interestingly, is that the local forms occur in the careful style as opposed to the casual style, which would be what we would typically expect from what we know about sociolinguistic theory and the attention to speech model developed by William Labov. So this is an inverted pattern of style shifting. It's the opposite of what we would typically expect to find. Okay. And I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about why I think we found this pattern. Okay, but just quickly on this, there are a few other reasons why I believe this pattern to be valid, as opposed to some kind of effect of the novel methodology that I've been using. So firstly, Holly Dan at the University of Sheffield has just completed her PhD on sociophonetic variation in West Cornwall, and she found a similar effect, particularly with the Bath vowel, and in other sort of Celtic nations, so other fringes of the UK, similar patterns have been found. So the Milroy's research in Belfast found something similar with philological variation, and also James Stuart Smith's research in Glasgow has found a similar inverted pattern, which suggests that communities which challenge in some way the standard language ideology seem to exhibit this inverted pattern of style shifting. Okay. And the other piece of evidence that I have that strongly supports this pattern is the metalinguistic commentaries of participants. Okay, and I've just got some examples here. So I think one of the most clear-cut examples is the fourth example here, which states that most Anglo-Cornish dialect words are working class words, but also used as a marker when you want to assert your Cornishness. So what is really interesting here, I think, is to consider, well, why are they wanting to assert their Cornishness? Because what we know from Lebov's attention speech model is that as attention increases, speakers tend to orient themselves towards more standard variants. But that isn't the case here. We find the opposite. So what I suggest is going on isn't merely attention to speech, it's attention to self. Now, if third wave sociolinguistics has taught us anything, it's that that language is far from isolated in the system of communication. It's one part of a much broader system of communication. So typically when we look at attention to speech, what we're really looking at is a shift towards forms which are perceived to be correct. And these are linked to a contextually desirable identity, which is linked to a standard language ideology. But what we're interested in this case is what happens when this desirable identity isn't to be correct in any way, but being local is more important. So what Boyle says is that what speaks is not the utterance, the language, but the whole social person. Okay, so this comes back to my point a moment ago of not just looking at language in isolation, but as a constituent part of a system of communication. Okay, so what I suggest is that when speakers pay greater attention to self, they closer approximate a desired self, a target self, which they aim to embody. And in this study, speakers with a strong sense of Cornish identity, for them, often the target self is a Cornish self. And so they're using words which are registered as Cornish in order to do this Cornish identity, which is aspirational. Being Cornish is aspirational for many people in this study. Okay, so this demonstrates what happens when the stylistic target isn't to be educated or posh or correct, as we typically expect to see in these sort of classic sociolinguistic studies, but the stylistic target is local in this context. Okay, and this manifests in a shift towards local forms when attention increases as opposed to away from them. Okay. And I think this finding really highlights the complex relationship between stigma and prestige and the Anglo-Cornish dialect in Cornwall. So that generally speaking, the dialect is overtly stigmatized, but also the shift towards Anglo-Cornish words in careful speech styles demonstrates that it has a local prestige. And this prestige isn't covert, it's very much overt, but it's local. Okay, so just to wrap up really from some of the key findings of my study and the things that I've spoken about today, to really reflect on why we should study Lexis. What is it that Lexis can do for us in terms of telling new stories about sociolinguistic variation and change? Now, the first thing I think that has been clear from this presentation is that lexical usage is highly structured, not only along the axis of social variation, but also stylistic variation. And this, along with Justyna's research and many other pieces of research which are becoming more and more common in recent years, this supports the idea that word usage is systematic, which counters the received wisdom, which is that words do not behave systematically. And lexis is a sensitive indicator of social variation and change. The key thing here is that speakers know this. Speakers are aware that lexis is a sensitive indicator of social variation and change. As a result, lexis can be used to stylize identities. And we've seen that today in the shift towards the Cornish forms in order to stylize or perform a Cornish identity. Okay. And we've also seen that cognitive sociolinguistic approaches to language variation and change are particularly insightful at the level of lexis. So we've seen that with the sort of prototype structures of the two semasiological variables, emit and made. But I think this is only sort of the start of the journey that we can have with lexis as sociolinguists. So some of the things that I think need to be addressed in the near future are that other methodologies should be developed which are appropriate for other part of speech categories. So Justyna's semasiological elicitation procedures are particularly useful for adjectives. I've shown they work slightly less well for nouns, but I think it would be brilliant to develop a sort of a methodology which works even better for nouns and also includes other parts of speech categories, so verbs and adverbs, etc. I'd also like to develop a more nuanced stylistic continuum for onomasiology. So I've demonstrated today there are two procedures that I've developed, which develops a sort of a binary concept of style. Obviously, style is much more complex than this, and I would like further points in that continuum. And also, I think it'd be interesting to consider the idea of semasiological style. I don't really have much of an idea of what this would look like or how this could be done, but I think this could be something that is potentially really interesting for future research to consider. And then lastly, I think we need more data. We need data from different communities and different linguistic contexts. And what this can do is potentially develop principles of lexical variation, because there's quite a lot of diversity at the moment in the findings of lexical studies. So I think it'd be really interesting to do a bit more of a meta-analysis once we get more data. And that's, for now, the end. So thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Please, thank you so much for taking us through the journey of your PhD. Yes, you have a lot of visual ovation here. If you have questions about Rhys's presentation, do keep them. First, we're going to listen to Sandra's and Mary's talk. So while Sandra is starting to share the screen and Rhys is sharing the screen, let me just say that Sandra started at her academic career in modern languages as a student of Hispanic linguistics in Birmingham. And she fell in love with the subject, started working for Oxford Bilingual Dictionary between English and Portuguese. And this is how she started getting interested in lexicography, and her positioning here at Sussex, at Brighton, gave her some more interest in corpus-driven lexicography, to the point that she's been for the last few years working on her dissertation, not only with lexicographer and a computational linguistic supervisor, but also with Mr. Schneider, Harold Schneider from Natural History Museum, because her research is into biodiversity, taxonomy, and lexis. I'm giving my floor here to Sandra. Sandra, welcome. The floor is yours.
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to thank Justyna and the Philological Society for giving me the opportunity to speak, and thank you to Rhys and Mary, because it's wonderful to be able to share the panel here with you today. And as Justyna has said in her introduction, then what I'm going to be talking to you about today is really looking at where what the importance of lexical variation is in domains outside pure linguistics, and looking at having a lexicographic approach to that, and why it might be useful. So firstly in my talk today, then, what I'd like to talk to you about is the relevance of the biological nomenclature, what it is exactly, why I decided it was a valid focus for my PhD thesis. I'll look at why the lexicographic approach I deemed to be a suitable approach to take, and given the issues that there were, and then I'll look to the method that I developed for my study and some of the results, and finally sort of future steps and different applications. So firstly, what do I mean by the scientific nomenclature? So the scientific nomenclature is a human constructed language. It's based on a hierarchical taxonomy that looks to model the hierarchy of life. So it's split up into kingdoms, orders, families, genera, species, and it is something that changes over time with different with evolving scientific knowledge. It's a very long-standing tradition, and obviously scientific knowledge relating to species has developed a lot over this time, over these hundreds of years. And so what you get with the scientific nomenclature, although you do have current accepted names, there's a multiplicity of this this language, this terminology that's used. So you can get examples of where a species, a defined species, may have multiple different terms for the same meaning, or like one term that can mean many different things. And then apart from that, then you don't just have the scientific nomenclature to speak of species. You also have the vernacular variant, so the common terms that are used to describe species. And so this is an example of a completely natural language variant system that runs in parallel to the scientific nomenclature. And so why did I choose this as a focus for the study? As I was saying, then the nomenclature is multiple, complex and evolving, and you've got this parallel system of natural language terms. And not only that, but the biological nomenclature and the natural language terms are used in many different domains. You have many different users who have many different needs and perspectives and objectives when they're using these terms, and so that also brings in another level of complexity when these terms are being used. But why is this relevant, really? Now then, in this digital age, then the scientific community more than ever looks to integrate data like we do with everything else. If you think of the internet and the semantic web, to be able to search all of these things, we need to be able to integrate the data. But there are a lot of questions. As I was doing the literature review for my thesis, then a lot of questions were arising about the stability or the consistency of usage over these terms, whilst there was also a lot of emphasis given to the importance of knowing what these terms, like how these terms are being used, despite the recognition of the importance of knowing what these terms are, how they're being used, and also a recognition of how variable they can be. There was a lack of an empirical analysis of the usage of these terms in context. And so this is why I decided that a lexicographic approach would be suitable. So why is lexicography relevant? So lexicography looks at word use in context. It is something that is very aware of the way that different contexts, different domains, different times can lead to different meanings in words, and also the way that the same words can mean different things in different contexts. So yes, and so the method that I developed was based on word sketches, which is one of the features from the sketch engine corpus query tool that Justyna mentioned in her introduction. And then I will describe in just a moment. Once I'd decided to use this feature, I went on to adapt the word sketches to look solely at the terms of interest. And then finally, I developed what I've called nomenclature profiling studies, in which I did kind of small case studies, even looking at specific species, and I was comparing them against official resources. So as I talked about the nomenclature being multiple and changing, so there isn't a one gold standard that exists, one official version of all of the different variants of species and how they're organized into the different categories. While there are many multiple ones that exist in parallel that are accepted and they're used, and some people will use one for one thing and another for another. And so I also wanted to look at the different variation there were in resources that I had identified throughout the literature review. So firstly, word sketches, for any of you who don't know, then they work like a sort of summary of a word in context. It's used in lexicography to help in the building of a dictionary entry. And I've just got an example here in which you've got mine in its form as a verb. So there's also, for mine, it's a special case where it's also a noun, and it can also be a pronoun. So you also have those separate word sketches too. But here, for example, if you were making a dictionary entry, then you can see that you've got different semantic meaning coming out. One that's more related to the extraction of physical elements from the earth, and also then you've got some relating to the extraction of data. So that could help separate out some different senses when you're making the dictionary entry. And so I thought that that would be very interesting in looking at the links between the different variants of the nomenclature, whether it be the scientific nomenclature or its vernacular variants, because of the way that grammatical relations are used in word sketches. Because it separates things out by different grammatical relations, then I wanted to see if it could help to extract the hierarchy that's in the taxonomic hierarchy that's inherent within the nomenclature. And so this brings me to the word sketch adaptation. And as I mentioned before, then the nomenclature, if we're talking about the binomial nomenclature, which is the way that species are described in the scientific nomenclature, then the first word it's two words, and it's the first word relates to the genus, and then the second word relates to the species. But it's that as a whole that is the term for the term or the variant that's used for the species. And so at different parts in my research, at the beginning of the research, when I was more interested in extracting the hierarchy and splitting it down as much as I could, then I defined the lexical unit as each single word, so you could clearly see the lines that went, if they were there in the corpus, that they're going through the family down into the genus, the species. But then in the nomenclature profile studies, which is the part of the results that I have chosen some of to go through with you today, then I just find the lexical unit as the unit itself that refers to for the species. So it was the genus plus the species word as one unit, because I was interested in seeing how that itself was characterized. Also, many of the vernacular names are multi-word units, so it was also important to keep them in the nomenclature profile studies as one unit. And then to actually adapt the word sketches, so I was only looking at words referring to species. Then in the case of the nomenclature profile studies, as I mentioned, I did an analysis of three official accepted resources for species for recording in the like species databases of different variants. So for the species that I was looking at, then I pulled out a list of the different variants that were there, and then tagged the two corpora, which I'll describe in a little bit, to only do that, and then the word sketches themselves I adapted to only select and pull out word sketches relating to those terms, and also only looked at grammatical relations that had been shown to have these hierarchical to pull out these hierarchical relations between the terms. And so, and then finally, what I used an API to pull all of that data down from the sketch engine, which I then created Python scripts for to just isolate the two terms that were collocates, the hierarchical relation, so whether it, like in that, then so say Oncorhynchus, mykiss, so Oncorhynchus being a genus, mykiss being a species level name, the parent-child relation according to the grammatical relation, and put them all together and displayed them as what I've called relation network graphs in a program that is called Cytoscape, which is usually used to depict biological networks. And so in the nomenclature profiling study, then I compared these different resources that I'd looked at. I'd looked at 3 different resources. One was called the Catalogue of Life, another the Vertebrate Ontology Taxonomy, and another the information taxonomy, integrated information taxonomy into information system. And so I wanted to compare them, one, to have a look at the numbers of different variants that were there, but also to look at the different ways that they portrayed the same apparent species, to see if there were similar numbers of variants, to see if all of the variants coincided, to see if the accepted names were all the same, this sort of thing. And then from that, then I had 2 corpora, one which was a purely academic corpora that was based on a specific journal, the Journal of for the Ecology of Freshwater Fish, and then the second journal corpus that I took keywords that I'd got from corpus analysis from the academic corpus, and scraped the web to create another similar corpus. The Jeff corpus was about 5 million words, and the web corpus was about 6 million. And then I did some frequency and distribution analyses, mainly to have a look to see if the ranking of the different terms was similar or different in the different in each corpus, and also to compare the scope of the different variants that appeared in the corpora in comparison with the full list of the resources. And finally, with the distribution, to also have a look to see if there was co-occurrence of certain variants, or if all of the variants were used in different contexts, to look at the different levels of synonymity that there might be there. And then finally, looking at the relation network graphs again. So this, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to just pull out a couple of things from one nomenclature profile study, which is one of Oncorhynchus mykiss, or otherwise known as rainbow trout. And what we've got here is a look at the frequency of the different terms that came out. So to give you an idea, in my analysis of the different resources, so the Catalogue of Life, the ITIS, and the Vertebrate Taxonomy Ontology, then there was a total of 64 different variants for this species, as relating to scientific variants, and 24 for common names. Under here you've got all of the different ones. It looks like the last half there isn't any, but I think each of those, it was just one single instance, or very, very few. But these are all the ones that appeared. It's a total of 32, I think. 13 of which were scientific names, and the others were the vernacular variants that appeared. So you've got quite a big scope. But you can see that really the ranking of the terms is very similar. So both for the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the first four, it's in the same. It's in the same ranking. The Oncorhynchus mykiss, which is the accepted name, both corpora had that as the most frequently used, term, and then the ones that supersede that are both common names. And these numbers are normalized for words per million. And so now I'm just going to have a little look at the different, some of the examples of lexical variation that I found, and I'll take you through that. So first it will be looking at scientific variants versus vernacular variants, then multiple vernacular variants, geographical specificity and usage, and also identifying incorrect grouping in the resources. So in relation to scientific variant to vernacular variant, here you can see in the yellow, then you've got trout as a blob, and there are many different arrows coming out to lots of different species names. And so this is one of the ways that the hierarchy can be shown with the relation network graphs. Trout was included in the catalogue of life as a common name synonym for Oncorhynchus mykiss. Here, what you can see is that it's a much broader term, because it covers many different species within the salmon, within the trout families. And then also here, then you can also see with rainbow trout and steelhead, which appeared in the a slide a couple of slides ago. Then you can see both steelhead trout, rainbow trout, and steelhead link down to Oncorhynchus mykiss. Rainbow trout is also linked to Salmon gardneri, which is another variant for the same species. So one, you can see a slight hierarchy, but also you can see the way that they link down. And this leads quite well into the multiple vernacular variant, because what I found is there were many vernacular variants, and particularly with this case with Oncorhynchus mykiss, then both rainbow trout and steelhead or steelhead trout or variants of this were very common. And I was interested to see whether there was any difference in meaning, like what the difference was. Was it that different authors perhaps were using them, or were they used concurrently? And so maybe they had some other sort of nuance in meaning. And to do this, then I looked at the co-occurrence of these terms in the same document. Would like to say that in my corpora, then they weren't split for authorship or time, geography. So that's something that in future research then I'd like to do, to be able to get further granularity on these sorts of analyses. But yeah, what I found was, so here you've got steelhead trout and rainbow trout that co-occurred in 66% of the documents that it could have done. And then there's some lower ones, but then also rainbow trout and steelhead in 49%. And so you could see that these variants were used in a lot of the different in a lot of the documents they could have done. And this was fairly consistent across both of the corpora, and in fact in the web scrape corpus it was even more prevalent. You see like 79% for the steelhead trout and rainbow trout, and then or 84% for rainbow trout and steelhead. So it kind of indicates that perhaps they were looked at, sometimes they were talked about concurrently as well. Oh wait, sorry. And so what I actually found with this is, when I was doing an external evaluation with biodiversity experts, when I spoke to the fish expert, then steelhead does actually refer to the trout when it's in the sea, and so it's a physical description of what happens to the trout. So when trout goes to sea, then it silvers up, is the way that they describe it. And so rainbow trout is when it's in the river, and steelhead trout is when it's in the sea. And apparently this is quite common, to have these different variants in the vernacular that describe different things, at least in the fish domain. Other experts were very stumped by it. So with the geographical specificity, then one of the things that I found, and this is just one example of it, was so there is a variant, and this appeared in both corpora. So you've got a specific vernacular variant, the Kamchatka steelhead. Kamchatka is a place in Russia, and it only appeared and was only linked to this particular incorrect or like not accepted variant of the scientific nomenclature, which is Parasalmo mykiss. And so this indicates, whilst it was a very infrequent mention, many of them were, as you saw at the beginning, and indicates that there may be some geographical specificity, not only in the vernacular name, which actually refers to a geographical place, but in the choices of scientific nomenclature that happens. This was also supported by the fish expert that I spoke to, because domains vary quite a lot in the different ways that they do it. But it sounded like that this happened. It shouldn't happen because there are only just one accepted name at a time, but people don't always use terminology in the way that it should be used. They have preferences. And then finally, one of the things that I noticed is that there was some incorrect grouping in the resources. It was infrequent, and it was always related to vernacular names. But there was one case in which brown trout was included as a synonym for Oncorhynchus mykiss, rainbow trout. But then when we looked at the data, it seemed strange anyway, but when we looked at the data, then we could see clearly that that this wasn't the case. Looking at the data, you can see the very big arrow linking to Salmo trutta there, which is the variant that it should be referring to. And also in the web here, you've got a much bigger arrow. There was one here between rainbow trout and brown trout, but that, yeah. So with future applications, then this method hopefully could be able to be used relating to semantic disambiguation of terms in context. It could be used for quality assurance, both of the looking at corpora to see whether terms are being used in an appropriate way to integrate it into other bodies of data, or also to check databases to see if there are any anomalies that need attention. Also with the profiling terms, to assess synonymity, to look for differences in the meaning, and also for selecting different resources for mapping. So as I mentioned, the different resources in the nomenclature profile studies, then the ITIS had a very specific focus, so they would only really include the accepted name, maybe a couple of variants, and maybe a common name. And it was very focused on what was a valid term and what was an invalid term, whereas the catalogue of life was very much about trying to find all of the possible terms that anybody has ever used for that species, to collect it all together. And also for the identification of evolving patterns of lexical variation and usage. And finally, the theoretical impact. Speaking today and in the context of this talk, I think it's really important to be aware of the applicability of linguistic approaches beyond linguistics, the importance of lexical variation for areas such as data integration, and the impacts that lexical variation can have in these sorts of areas. So thank you. Mary will be going to speak now, but any questions later I'll be happy to answer. And then there's references.
Okay, and that's again, congratulations. Thank you very much. There are lots of virtual ovations here as well. I can see lots of people clapping. So now we'll just move to our final speaker of today's evening, Mary Edward. We had some technical issues, so Mary is here with us, but we'll hear a pre-recorded presentation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to today's talks. And as my colleagues presented on lexical variation, my talk will be focusing on lexical variation in sign language. And I'll present a cross-linguistic comparison of 2 sign languages used in Ghana. I'm Mary Edward, and I'm from the University of Brighton as well. So by way of introduction, sign languages are the natural languages of deaf communities around the world. And the scientific study of sign languages began in earnest in the 1960s, pioneered by the work of William Stokey. Since then, many sign languages of the world have been studied, but African Sign Languages still remain understudied, unfortunately. So in today's talk, I'll focus on lexical variation in sign languages by concentrating more on 2 sign languages that are used in Ghana, West Africa, and these are Ghanaian Sign Language and Adambrobe Sign Language. You've heard a lot of lexical variation today. You've seen that the existence of lexical variation has been identified as an intrinsic part of all languages, irrespective of the modality, whether signed or spoken, we have lexical variation. And lexical variation in different sign languages have been documented by different researchers working on different European and American sign languages. Different factors have been documented to contribute to lexical variation in sign languages, and these include gender, ethnicity, social class, and region. So these social variables are distinctive to different signing communities, and their manifestations do vary. So in today's study, I'm going to present a finding on lexical variation in Ghanaian Sign Language and Adambrobe Sign Language. I'll explore variation in 2 semantic categories, that's handheld tools and appliances. So tools that are held by the hands and household appliances. So I'll consider the differences and similarities between these 2 sign languages based on 1, iconic strategies for naming handheld tools and appliances. I will explain later. I also consider consistency and full agreement within the 2 sign languages in using the strategies for naming handheld tools and appliances. And I also considered lexical variation based on the formational parameters of the sign, which will also be explained later. And I also look at the effects of the methodology in eliciting these lexical items. So the following are my research questions, and the presentation will try to answer these research questions. We will not follow according to how it is asked here though. So the first question is, are there differences and similarities in how these categories are presented, that is handheld tools and appliances, are presented in GSL or Ghanaian Sign Language and Adambrobe Sign Language? What are the strategies used in each sign language to represent these semantic categories? I'll look at the effect of the methodology in eliciting data and how it affected the representation of the lexical items. And I'll consider iconicity, which is form, meaning, resemblance mapping, and look at how it contributes to lexical variation in sign language. So we're looking at 2 sign languages here, Ghanaian Sign Language and Adambrobe Sign Language. Ghanaian Sign Language is an urban sign language used predominantly in deaf communities in Ghana. Adambrobe Sign Language is a rural sign language used only in Adambrobe community in Ghana. So Ghanaian Sign Language is used by deaf majority, deaf schools, on national television for interpretation and all that. Adambrobe Sign Language is only used by deaf and hearing signers of Adambrobe community. Ghanaian Sign Language developed after the establishment of the first school for the deaf in Ghana, which was pioneered by Dr. Andrew Foster, a user of American Sign Language. That's the relationship with American Sign Language. But Adambrobe Sign Language is a very old sign language, which is believed to have emerged in the 18th century. So currently there are estimated over 100,000 deaf people in Ghana. That's 0.4% of the population of Ghana. And a large number of these people are believed to be users of Ghanaian Sign Language. On the other hand, there are only 40 deaf people in Adambrobe community right now. That's a community of about 3,000 people, representing 1.3% of the population. So Ghanaian Sign Language is a language of instruction in deaf institutions, but Adambrobe Sign Language signers, the older signers, have not been given formal education, and The younger deaf signers have formal education, so the younger deaf signers are bilinguals in Ghanaian Sign Language and Nampobe Sign Language. So why these two sign languages? So to date, as I said, there have been very little research on African Sign Languages, and Ghanaian Sign Language and Nampobe Sign Language are no exception. However, there is even very little research on Ghanaian Sign Language as compared to Nampobe Sign Language. The very detailed research on Nampobe Sign Language we have so far is Victoria's dissertation. And since that dissertation was published in 2007, there have been a considerable amount of contact between Ghanaian Sign Language and Nampobe Sign Language, because more deaf children from Nampobe are going to school and they have been exposed to Ghanaian Sign Language. The church service in Nampobe, which used to be interpreted in Nampobe Sign Language, is now delivered straight in Ghanaian Sign Language because of the death of the interpreter. And Nampobe signers are introduced to Ghanaian Sign Language through community outreach. And there's also the pressure to adopt a widely used sign language, which is Ghanaian Sign Language. So for the data collection, signers of these two sign languages watched selected images of handheld tools and appliances. So we had 22 handheld tools and 6 appliances. And signers were specifically instructed to present how these images are depicted in their individual sign languages. So for participants, I had 10 signers from each sign language. All the 10 signers from Ghanaian Sign Language who use Ghanaian Sign Language are educated, but 8 of the signers from Nampobe did not have any formal education. Nampobe signers, 2 of them were equal bilingual in Ghanaian Sign Language and Nampobe Sign Language. So these 22 handheld tools and appliances were coded out of a larger set of 50 lexical items. I coded with Elan. Elan is a language annotation software. Maybe some of us here have come across it from the Max Planck Institute of Technology. It's very good for annotating both spoken language, sign language, gestures, code-speech gestures. And the videos were coded for 1, the use of iconic strategy in signs. And these iconic strategies or iconic types considered types such as instrument, handling, tracing, entity, measure stick, etc. I will give examples of these on the next slide. I also looked at the phonological representation of the sign. So phonology here looks at the formational parameters, the shape of the hand, location, the movement, the orientation, and manual hands, non-manual features, whether it's 1 hand or 2 hands. I also considered how many parts were given in each sign. For example, so the sign syringe in Ghanaian Sign Language was mostly signed as a 2-part sign, consisting of the sign hospital and needle. And I also looked at figure-ground relationship, and these considered signs that use the 2 hands to depict an item in relation to a ground object. So like key, where this is the figure and this is the ground. I also considered motivated location, where the use of the sign is motivated by the specific use of the item. So spoon to the mouth or scissors for cutting the hair. I also looked at initialization or lexical finger spelling. So these were considered non-iconic or not clear. So initialization refers to the use of the hand shape of the Ghanaian Sign Language alphabet to represent the first letter of the word. So like water, W, or finger spelling like television, TV. So back to the definition. So iconicity has to do with the resemblance relationship between form and meaning. So we look at the properties of the linguistic form and the properties of the things in the world, how they resemble each other. And the visual modality, of course, affords a high degree of iconicity, but iconicity is exhibited in both signed and spoken languages. So in English, we have onomatopoeia, like tweet, bang, these are all iconic sounds. Or in idiophones, in a can or few, where in my language, I can whim means to walk swiftly, and this is iconic of the nature of the walking. So these are the stimulus materials I use, the 22 handheld tools gave me 281 tokens from Ghanaian Sign Language signers and 275 tokens. So these are examples of the handheld tools. And the tokens are more because some of the signers depicted those items with 2 tokens, like hospital and syringe. And the appliances were just 6. So these were the 6: TV, computer, fridge, standing fan, ceiling fan, and sewing machine. So these are the exact pictures that were shown to signers. So the images were specifically selected so that signers could associate with them. For example, for sewing machine, I couldn't use an electric machine because most of the signers will not be able to associate what electric machine was used for. It would be a novel item to them. So the strategies for iconic mappings, these are some of the strategies I considered handling, where the hand represents a hand holding an object, or holding and manipulating or grasping an object. So key or instrument, where the hand depicts features of the objects and performs actions related to it. So maybe toothbrush, where this one is a brush. Or entity, where the hand only shows features of the object and does not perform any action in relation to it, like bottle. Or measure stick, where the hand shows objects by delimiting relevant parts of the object. So bottle, so this is a measurement of it, or cup, or small pepper. So you can see how the measure stick is depicted. And tracing strategy could be classified into 2, but in this presentation, all the 2 be presented as tracing. But I just wanted to show you that we have 2D type of tracing and 3D type of tracing. With the 2D, the hands as drawing tools and movements create visual shapes in space, so like television. Or 3D, where the hand and the movement represent the shape of the entity by tracing the outline of the entity, so like plate. Or another strategy, which was developed specifically for this work, is presentable action, and where we use embodied conceptual gestures in a source culture that are used to code both abstract and tangible experiences. So presentable action could also refer to metonymic relationships. An example is using cold to represent fridge. Cold is a network of association related to fridge because refrigerators or fridge produces cold. So the first analysis was to consider the iconic strategies used for handheld tools. And for Ghanaian Sign Language, this was what I found. The use of more instruments followed by handling, little entity and tracing. They didn't use measure stick or any other strategy mainly. So these were the strategies that were used. So I compared it to Adambabe Sign Language, and this is what I found. Adambabe signers used more instruments and lesser handling, but both of them used the same entity strategy. Adambabe signers used measure stick, but they didn't use tracing. You could see that all the 22 handheld tools were basically represented in these strategies. So this table here shows some of the items that were 100% represented in a particular strategy, those that had other strategies as well. So I will go through. So if you have questions afterwards, we can look at it. The second analysis considered iconic strategies used for appliances. And with this, I also identified instruments, handling, tracing, and presentable action for Ghanaian Sign Language. You could see they use more instrument forms, so hand as the object performing an action. When I compared it with Ghanaian Sign Language, I realized that Ghanaian Sign Language did not really show with Adambabe Sign Language. I realized that Adambabe Sign Language did not show a clear preference for either instruments or handling. So you see, instruments and handling were used almost at the same level, but they used more tracing and they used a little less of presentable action. So here we see more instruments in handheld tools by Adambabe, but less instruments in appliances by Adambabe signers. So these are also the individual items and the iconic strategies they produced. I considered consistency and full agreement. So consistent use of a strategy is defined as more than 70% of signers use the same strategies, and full agreement is defined as 100% of signers use the same strategy in each group. So consistency and full agreements consider the iconic strategies, not the formational parameters. So far, I've not really talked about the formational parameters. So for example, there are a few signs we used within groups that had the same iconic strategies, but different profiling of the handship. So they had different formational parameters. So in other words, the sign or the representation of the object was not the same, but the iconic strategy was the same. And to go back or to bring out my informational parameters has to do with the phonology of the sign, that's the hand shape, the movements, the location, the orientation, and whether you use one hand or two hands, or all that. So here I present an example of a sign that presented 100% full agreement, had consistency, used the same iconic strategy, but there was, so you could see this is mobile phone in Ghanaian Sign Language. It's at 100% consistency as an instrument. I could see that these two signers here had two different informational parameters. So the 8 signers above used the bowl-shaped mobile phone, but these two signers used the G-shaped mobile phone, like a telephone with a mobile phone with a pole or something. But these strategies are all the same. These are all instrument strategies. So that's what we mean by the same iconic strategy, but different informational parameters. So the differences here is just the hand shape. The location is the same. The orientation is the same. Movement is the same, just the hand shape. So this third analysis presents the results of full agreements and consistency. So we saw that for handheld tools, both sign languages had the same full consistency, but Adamoba Sign Language were in more full agreements, like most signers use the same strategy for the same object as compared to Adamoba signers. On the other hand, when we move to appliances, Ghanaian Sign Language signers had more consistency and more full agreement as compared to Adamoba Sign Language signers, and we'll try to explain why this could be the case on subsequent slides. So now move on to formational parameters, or the variation found in formational parameters. So the formational parameters, as I said, refers to the hand shape or the shape of the hand in signing, the movement of the hand in signing, the location as the places on the body or on the signers in signing space where signing takes place, or the orientation refers to the direction of the palm in signing. Then manual markers refers to whether the sign uses facial expression, the body is shifted, tilted to the left or right, or whether the sign uses one hand like he, or is made with two hands like he. And if it is made with two hands, we want to consider whether there is figure-ground relationship, where this is the figure and this is the ground. So examples of lexical variation based on formational parameters are presented on the screen. So I brought 3 examples from handheld tools in Ghanaian Sign Language, where we have 3 variants based on the formational parameters. So the first variant is syringe, which is located on the bum or the rump, or syringe located on the shoulder, or syringe as an instrument that is being used, like pressing a syringe on something. Where you see the cross sign, that is 2-part sign, where the sign for hospital is a cross on the shoulder. We coded this as not clear because it didn't fall in any of the iconic strategies that we discussed, but it's iconic because it's metonymically referred to the building in which the syringe is used. Then for scissors, we identify 3 variants based on the formational parameters. So you see that syringe like barbering the hair, or syringe used in neutral space, or syringe used with figure ground, where the one hand is the syringe and the other hand is an object. Also, another example presented here is key, which have 3 variants in Ghanaian Sign Language based on the formational parameters. So key as handling, key as figure ground, or key with the K hand shape, which was coded as not clear because the K hand shape didn't fall in any of the strategies we've been discussed so far. So we coded it as not clear. And also we looked at appliances. We saw that computer had 4 variants based on the formational parameters. So either computer mouse, computer as typing, or computer as laptop, or computer as a hand holding computer. Or standing fan, which had also 4 variants. So either standing fan, standing fan, standing fan, standing fan. And this variant is quite similar to this. So this sign had standing fan. Then we have another, this variant is also the same as this. And this sign added standing fan with a leg, and it goes like this one. So, or you know, ceiling fan had just 2 variants. So either ceiling fan or ceiling fan. When we come to Adam Sign Language, we selected examples such as bottle, when bottle had 3 variants based on the formational parameters. So it's either bottle with a measure stick, bottle with a handling strategy like drinking, bottle with an entity strategy where the arm represents the bottle itself, or bottle that uses a combination of the drinking strategy and the entity strategy, and bottle that uses 2 strategies. So the first one is sweet, the second one is the measure stick. So here, sweets wasn't added to the strategies because it gives information about what goes into the bottle as compared to the products we're looking at. So we had 3 variants. That's 1, 2, and 3. Okay, then syringe, again in Adam Sign Language, had 2 variants, syringe on the bum or syringe on the shoulder. Then scissors had 2, it's either in the neutral space or on the head. Then when we considered appliance, so that's when we saw more variants. So standing fan had 4 variants in Adam Sign Language. So it's either standing fan, standing fan, standing fan, standing fan, or standing fan. So 4 variants as well. So this one and this one were just coded as 1 variant. This and this as 1. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then computer is either computer typing, computer like tracing, computer like hand typing on the hand, computer like tracing something on the screen, and again typing as well. So this sign had 2 part sign. Or television, such as tracing, television such as tracing with 3D, and television such as tracing with 3D and adding C. We just have 3 variants for that. So I've mentioned the fact that some iconic strategies had different formational parameters. So we could see sewing machine. This is Adam signer with 1 hand sewing. Ghanaian signer with 2 hands. That's the handling hand, and this one is the entity. Then tracing for television. Adam signer uses the 3D. The Ghanaian signer uses the 2D. Mobile phone, these 2 are Adam signers. One uses what we call the B hand shape. The other uses the A hand shape. Ghanaian signers, one uses the Y hand shape. One uses the G hand shape. These 4 different variants we all use the instrument strategy. So the iconic strategy is the same, but the formational parameters are different. So when we consider the effects of the methodology, we identified that the specific stimulus materials used for the data elicitation were actually based on signers' ability to connect with the object, and also other research that had used images instead of words. So using lexical items enabled all signers to be able to name the target object. And although signers did not use only iconic forms, the images may have prompted more iconic forms to be derived, especially from the Ghanaian Sign Language signers, as some of the objects on the list were actually presented in different dictionaries of Ghanaian Sign Language with lexicalization and finger spelling, but with iconic strategies here. And an example is all the signers who use the lexical finger spelling for television had additional iconic forms. So this is TV. So they will have TV outline. Also, using pictures enable all signers of Adam Sign Language to identify with the objects. As said earlier, 80% of the Adam signers have not had formal education. Thus, it would have been difficult to connect with words on the screen as compared to images. Now let's consider iconicity and lexical variation. So we've seen that signers had different choices of iconic strategies over the others. So for example, handheld tools were either instruments or handling, and appliances were also either instruments or handling. So we saw that the different ways of construing or presenting an object depends on what the form presents, the different construals of the form, the different ways of thinking about the form, and the different ways of thinking about the meaning. So whereas handheld tools had high proportion depicted with figure grounds, so you could have key, cap, or scissors. Appliances were mostly profiled with both hands or with one hand. And if it was both hands were doing the same thing. So cold for fridge, hand instruments for fan or ceiling fan. There was hardly two hands performing different things. So the choice of a simultaneous strategy like key, cap, scissor, as compared to sequential strategies such as hospital syringe, and the different iconic and arbitrary forms that were used also shows a different network of association that are connected to a depicted image. So, for example, fridge was mostly construed by Ghanaian Sign Language signers as cold and trace. Adambabe signers use cold, open door, and like drink water. So cold shows it freezes things. Open door show that's a sign for fridge in BSL that we open the door. Water means we put water in it to make it colder. So in summary, signers make predominant use of different iconic strategies, especially instrument and handling for the category of handheld tools, and this has been found in earlier research as well. Whereas GSL signers prefer instrument strategy for the category of appliances, Adambabe signers prefer both instruments and handling, so they didn't show a specific preference there. We saw that consistency in handheld tools was same for both sign languages, and consistency and full agreement was higher in appliances for GSL. Both sign language use different iconic forms to name handheld tools and appliances, as you've seen. We've seen that different iconic forms, same iconic forms could have different informational parameters. So here we indicated that variants in sign language can be considered either looking at the iconic strategy or looking at the informational parameters of the sign. So the choice of a variant is dependent on the methodology for the elicitation or the need to show form meaning mapping. So for example, if signers, Ghanaian Sign Language signers were shown words, obviously most of the signs would have been less iconic as compared to being shown the object itself, or signers having the need to show an iconic base of the sign, for example, using TV trays as compared to just TV. So iconicity is depicted in the formational parameters of the sign as well. So the hand shape, the location, the orientation, the movement makes the sign either iconic or non-iconic. But the same iconic strategies can have different formational parameters. So you could have either ceiling fan or ceiling fan. These are all instruments by different formational parameters. We've seen that consistency and full agreement reveal specific domains in which signers in both sign languages have similar signs to name the objects. So you could see that Ghanaian Sign Language and Adambabe Sign Language used more like similar sign for like instruments, similar hand shape. So one argument supporting the differences and similarities among signers is a choice of strategies. So consistency and full agreement is in the age of the sign language and the novelty of the sign. So let me explain further. So ADSL, Adambabe Sign Language, as an older sign language, demonstrated consistency and full agreement in handheld tools. However, GSL demonstrated higher consistency in appliances, demonstrating the connection with science and technology as compared to the intra-community use of ADSL. And as noted, most of the signers from ADSL didn't even own a mobile phone, a television, a fridge, or a sewing machine. So we identified that lexical variants are also based on signers' experiential knowledge and the images that are associated with the objects. Therefore, signers have what we call individual and community preferences of iconic strategies. So the individual preferences refers to specific iconic strategies that signers use over other things, such as using either sequential like he or maybe he. On the other hand, community preferences prefers conventions shared by all members of the language community, such as the handshake for instruments. So for scissors, which was just the same, but could be located on the head or in the neutral space. And I compared the handshake for scissors for the handshake for scissors in British Sign Language, and it was just the same. So there are specific strategies that are available to a particular signing community. I also argue that the inconsistencies in appliances category for demographic signers could also mean that those items were novel and individual preferences of the signers were needed to name them. In conclusion, differences between signers indicate the varied iconic strategies available in the visual spatial modality. Variation in sign language is not just a product of social factors. Iconicity, age of sign language, and methodological innovation of the research can contribute to lexical variation in sign language. Comparing GSL and DSL signers, we identified that the use of varied iconic strategies to name specific lexical items. We also identified the different skills of profiling, like profiling folk with either the tines or with handling, depending on what signers want to present, what's information about the item they want to bring across. So we could also make inferences such as the effect of language exposure on specific domain and the ability to name items in such domain. As I said, most of the ADSL signers were not exposed to the technical aspects of the appliances. What of methodology? Using pictures for the elicitation task enabled all signers to name the target objects. And we've seen that signers did not only use iconic forms, the images, but more of the images have more form meaning mapping derived especially from Ghanaian Sign Language signers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And there is a quick apology from me because I should have introduced you properly, Mary. I'll just say that you all now know that Mary is really fluent in another language or languages, sign languages. She, after her undergraduate studies in Ghana, she came to her master's in linguistics in Bergen in Norway and continue with PhD at Sussex. Both of those postgraduate degrees founded by respective host institutions. And now all this investment in Mary's education paid off of this beautiful research on very unresearched communities. Perhaps I would give the floor to Susan. You could let us know how much time we've got, how we would like to manage the discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, and thank you very much, you three. This has been extremely interesting and certainly incredibly detailed and varied topics for our interest. I'm conscious it's just after 6 o'clock, so I propose that we spend maybe 20-25 minutes with some questions. And I think, Justyna, if you as the chair of the panel, you can field questions. I think that would be excellent. And if there are questions that, for example, come up in the chat, we can load those.
Okay, we've got good plan of action. So there are lots of synergies in the talks that we've seen. And I've even prepared the whole slide by listening to the presentations on thinking about connections. The issues that certainly come up are issues of methodological nature. So how are we calibrating the variable? How are we calibrating variation? How are we eliciting? What's the strengths and weaknesses of various elicitation procedures versus using corpus? What's the tension between the individual variation versus community variation? How do innovations come out? There is a lot of food for thought. But let me open the floor to everybody here with regards to asking questions, and I can certainly fill in the gaps if there are any. I don't think there will be, but.
So Klaus has a question, I think.
Yes, thank you very much to all three. That was extremely interesting. And I have a question for Rhys. The inverted pattern of style shifting was a very interesting finding. And I wondered whether it predicts anything for the future of Cornish English. I mean, on the surface, one would think that if it's not done informally, then certainly it must be have a negative, or the prediction must be that Cornish English will go. On the other hand, of course, as a marker of identity, perhaps that might outlive, because informal usage can shift quickly, while if you know something and you use it deliberately, then perhaps it will last longer. That is the first part of my question. And the second part is, the informal usage, was that the comparison where the differences between the pictures had to be found? And I wonder whether there might have been accommodation to the language of the researcher, whether the researcher was also a Cornish speaker, Cornish English speaker. So two-part question.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So we had the first part of the question, which was to do with sort of what are the future prospects for the variety, given yes. the stylistic variation that we see. And that's a really interesting question. I think the way to consider that question is to sort of blend the social and the stylistic variation that I've collected. So we see a really strong age effect, whereby 3 of the 4 investigated onomasiological variables are used primarily by older speakers, and very rarely, in 2 of the cases, actually not at all by any of the younger speakers. Okay, so we're seeing a pattern of obsolescence here, where these words are becoming recessive and they're dropping out of use. This isn't only true of usage, but I conducted another short experiment as well, which was to study the recognition of Cornish dialect words. So not only did people, was I interested in whether or not people use these words, but I was interested in also whether or not people just knew them. And my findings in the usage and recognition side of the data collection marry up quite nicely. So 3 of the words, no, sorry, two of the variables were not identified as having Cornish variants by most younger speakers. So this is consistent with the finding that most people don't use these words most of the time. They save them for particular contexts, such as the sociolinguistic interview, but obviously other contexts as well. So yeah, lots of young people didn't even know these words, which suggests that they are falling out of use. Mm-hmm. And there were a couple of exceptions to that. The exceptions were emmet and maid, where pretty much everyone knew those words, because these words are really explicitly used formatively. So in order to perform, to do a Cornish identity. So they're quite low frequency, but they are highly salient when they're used, which I think accounts for why these 2 words are slightly different to the other words I investigated. So yeah, I think emmet and maid might continue to be used, but only in specific contexts, whereas the other variants I think are dropping out of use. And then the second question was to do with accommodation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I guess every sociolinguistic study that's done has some kind of issue with accommodation to the researcher, right? I mean, that's sort of inherent in collecting data in this way. And I'm from Cornwall myself, but as you can probably hear, I don't have a particularly strong Cornish accent. I speak sort of in a sort of generic southeastern accent, I suppose. But the issue with accommodation is that and why I don't think it's really an effect here is because I was doing the interview at both stages, in both elicitation procedures. It was still me, so the dimension of sort of accommodation was held constant throughout those two elicitation procedures, yet we got different data. And I actually had a sort of a really angry email from a member of the public from Cornwall recently, and he was trying to he took issue with my finding that Cornishness was performed, and to him he was saying, this isn't performed, this is fundamentally who I am, and I'm basically saying that my findings were wrong, which is quite interesting. And his issue again was with the accommodation, and he was arguing that had I spoken in a Cornish accent or used lots of Cornish words, I may have got more Cornish words in my data and in different contexts. And ultimately, the answer is, I don't know if I would have got different data had I spoken differently. I can only speak the way that I speak. I think to purposely put on a Cornish accent in order to collect data would be really disingenuous and really poor sort of ethical practice. So, I spoke in the way that I speak, and maybe that influenced the data that I collected in some way.
Well, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I've got a question to Mary. You have noticed, you see, I'm a sociolinguist, and with all the talks, I'm just looking for sociolinguistic variation in usage. And you have noticed that education here influences the variation in usage. What's the situation with education influencing variation in sign language? Why I'm asking that, because a couple of weeks ago, we had Adam Shembri talking at Sussex about his research on British Sign Language. And he mentioned that there's not so many kind of dialects, but there is what's important in the variation and the different signage is the school that the person went to. Whereas what you hear saying is that educated versus uneducated speakers, that's the explanation of variation.
Okay, thank you, Justyna. I'm sorry if my voice is a bit very low. Can you all hear me? Okay. Sign language has always been influenced by education for a very long time, and sign languages used in Ghana are no exception. But surprisingly, for my research, for my data, the particular signers who were invited for this research in Adambrobe were two categories of signers: those who have been to school and those who have not been to school. And a lot of researchers, including myself, have mentioned the infiltrating effect of education on the sign language of Adambrobe. But for this research, what I found out that I couldn't even talk about on my slide is the fact that those who have been to school did not borrow any sign from the sign language they use at school, showing that they have a clear understanding of two sign languages in use. However, the adults who haven't been to school but have been introduced to the sign language of the school by the children and other social intervention, advocacy, other groups, were the ones who were borrowing lexical items from the school sign, indicating that they literally were not aware that they were using two different signs in their conversation. So that's the effect of school or education. And as Adam said, he was very right. Even if you go to boarding schools for deaf children in Ghana, you will find different signs that can only be associated with the school. So school really plays an important role. But for my signers from Adambrobe, those who have been to school were not in any way affected by the fact that they've been to school. was rather those who haven't been to school, who were affected by the influence of being with those who have been to school. I hope I made my
Absolutely, thank you very much. It makes me think about, it's like using your dialectal word and you move to the other side of country and you still use that word. It wouldn't work as well, only if you want to show your identity that you are from a particular part of the country. So that's why I find it fascinating that those speakers were not really changing the signage, and what it tells us about the meaning in mind and variation. Is it the meaning in mind that is important more than a representation of it? I'm not sure where I'm going with it, but I wonder if you could help me.
I think what was really important to them was to keep their distinctive sign language, not to mix it with the school sign. Because obviously when these children go to, or students go to school, they are not allowed to communicate in any way in their village sign language. So an opportunity from a researcher to communicate in your village sign language alone gives them an exposure to run into their sign language with full force. One other thing I didn't also talk about is the fact that when these students are communicating among each other, they don't even communicate in the village sign at all. They communicate in the school sign, basically because they want to hide information from some of the older signers who do not know the school sign, or they want to hide information from the signers in the village who are hearing but do not know the school sign. So it's for me was quite interesting to know that when they had an opportunity to express themselves in the school sign, they deliberately decided not to, but to stick on to the village sign, which shows their ideological stand towards the village stand in one way. And it also shows the fact that though they are able to move across the school sign, they are also equally bilingual in their own language. And even if they don't have a lexical item in their language, they'll prefer to improvise than to borrow from the school sign.
Thank you, Mary. It gets us to the question of the negotiation of meaning between individual and community. That's the area of linguistics that's recently has been growing, where we're trying to negotiate what's the, let's say, language variation at the level of individual and the community. And I think all the papers somehow touch on that negotiation. Mary, with your explanation now of education, Sandra as well, with the trout being seen as different, in a way, not species, but having different properties, whether it's rainbow or steel, across different contexts, and negotiating this with the whole community territory. Rhys, what's happening with, like, say, your data? Do you have any kind of negotiation between individual and community? Have you noticed any tensions of that kind in your data?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really fundamental actually to the way that these words are used, in terms of a lot of them have very have social meaning, so they're shifting throughout different generations. So this links to a shift more broadly in Cornish identity. So Cornwall has a long history of industrial work, so particularly mining, and it also has a history as a Celtic nation. And lots of particularly older people align to this identity, but younger people tend to align to an identity which is more centered around a particular lifestyle associated with Cornwall and its perceived aesthetic beauty. And so these are really different identities, and these sort of have linguistic correlates, these two distinct identities. So some of the more traditional Cornish words, particularly crib and crouse, which are the words for lunchbox in Cornwall, and associated heavily with mining and sort of industrial work. A lot of the older speakers use these words because that's something they're really proud of and a part of the identity that they want to connect with. But a lot of younger speakers really want to avoid this identity. So it's a complex interaction between the younger people still wanting to be Cornish, but not wanting to be the same kind of Cornish as their parents or grandparents. So they have a slightly distinct repertoire of words that they can use, and sort of other levels of language as well, not only words. But Emmet is an interesting example where it has really distinct social meanings attributable to both of those distinct identities. It has some social meanings which are really attributable to these older speakers with even a nationalistic sense of Cornish identity, but it also has social meanings associated with people who welcome tourism. So even though it's generally perceived to be a derogatory word for tourists, a lot of younger people use it in sort of a tongue-in-cheek way with their friends who aren't Cornish. So the same word being used, but very different types of identity work being used. So I think that highlights the sort of diversity of social meanings that can be attributable to not only one word, but to sort of one sociolinguistic variable.
Thank you very much. I will pause with my comments. I wonder if there is if there are any voices coming from the audience. If so, just please unmute and talk.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Just a bit of a question about the Cornish speakers who use maid to mean women. I was wondering how much it retained of the original meaning of girl. So on the one hand, can it still be used for children? On the other hand, is it still associated in particular with younger or unmarried women?
Yeah, so in the Cornish dialect, it can be used in both contexts in terms of younger and older women. I would say it's slightly probably more common when the referent is a younger woman. So, the OED cites a virgin woman as one of the earliest definitions of the word maid. And I think that then has a sort of association with youth, which is probably slightly more common. But old maid is often used in Cornwall as well. So that's a phrase that you'd often hear in Cornwall, is she was an old maid, which is suggesting that the age isn't a core feature of the meaning of the word, although it might be might have some kind of probabilistic impact in terms of the way that it's used.
Okay.
Klaus, did you want to come in?
Yes, a question to Sandra. Now, it's reassuring to know that even biology has problems with, terminology and taxonomy. But thinking about how it's used in context, would these different names or usages, would they really create a problem, or would speakers, listeners in each situation know which species is talked about? So do we have to do something about it? Or, were there instances where sort of a real problem occurred because of the varied naming of species?
Well, this was firstly why I started looking at it in the literature review, because it was identified as a problem because people may have different ideas of what these terms are. And in the integration of data, sometimes these terms mean completely different species that have never been linked, but they've been given the same name. But also, the answer to your question is that it depends. From the data that I've gathered and from the external evaluation that I did, which consisted of a focus group of different experts who actually had quite varying opinions. I ended up with a corpus that was particularly linked to fish, or two corpora that were particularly linked to fish. And the fish expert actually thought that there was a lot of confusion that was related to species because there's such a plethora of different terms. So one, everybody agreed that for people who are who are starting out, so students or people who aren't experts, and then because there are so many non-experts who use scientific nomenclature, then they use it incorrectly because they don't understand that two variants are actually speaking about the same species. And so therefore you can propagate misunderstanding there. But there were also other scientists said that once you've understood all of that, then there's no problem. The fish expert said that that is a continual problem that he faces constantly throughout his work, because in particular the fish domain is actually quite special in all of this because there are lots of different commercial interests. You can have people working in biodiversity, you can have people working in commercial fishing, you can have outlook, and so there are a lot of cross purposes going on when people are speaking. So yeah, I would say that I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And it sounds like as if there would be some benefit in clearing it up. Of course, the cost of imposing sort of shared taxonomy or terminology must be weighed against, you know, the possibility of misunderstanding. But it sounds like as if there would be some benefit in getting it sorted.
My suggestion was never to impose because there are many different taxonomies. It is constantly changing. You can't impose one because you need to be able to look at the whole history. It's the accumulation of all of this evolution of taxonomy that needs to be continued to be considered throughout the whole period. It's just being able to have a method by which you can actually study that and see how it is being used in that particular context, to categorize it by the way that it was used, trying to take the vision, like using my method to be able to take the vision of from the perspective that the person who wrote it, rather than imposing an outside taxonomy because you say that that's the right one. So yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
Any other questions? I've got a question to all of the speakers. It seems like there is just so much happening when it comes to the actual variable in lexical variation. First of all, because you can have one concept that can be represented through, I think, Sandra, you said 64 items for trout? I think this was...
it would 64 items for one specific species of trout.
So many variants for the same linguistic variable. And also what we see here is basically on our eyes, because Mary demonstrated how the new word for computer comes in, right? So there was a new concept and a new word, and suddenly the different, I'm trying to sign. So this was the sign for the phone, or this for the phone, right? Is coming in. So what would you say if we say that this is a unique property of Lexis, that the kind of flexibility in creating new variables? Because I just feel like in phonology, to create a new variable, there are a lot of processes need to happen. First, I can think of some examples from history of English. There must have been a borrowing for the new sound to come in, or I mean, there seems to be some kind of easiness with which there are new variables created, and also variables with many, many, many variants. Would you say it's unique to Lexis, or if not, then why? What's your take on that?
Shall I go first, as I was the first speaker? Maybe you can do it in that order. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something it's really unique to Lexis. So if we're looking at phonetics, phonology, or morphosyntax, we typically have established variables. You may then have innovative new variants, but the variables themselves are pretty constant. But obviously that's not the case with Lexis. You know, something like a computer, as Mary mentioned, that's something that we need to develop a lexicon around and ways to refer to it. So I think this is a really, it's definitely a unique function of lexical variation. I know that Jack Greaves done some really interesting work on social media and Twitter on innovations and looking at how they sort of spread through social networks. And obviously Lexis changes very quickly, which comes back to one of the reasons why I think it's a really interesting level of language to study in terms of its social meaning, is that that Lexis doesn't have the same kind of acquisitional constraints that many other levels of language have. So, you know, in sociolinguistics, the apparent time construct is predicated on the assumption that once we acquire language, the language we use is relatively stable over our lifetime. But Lexis seems to be a real exception to that. It seems that we could continue to acquire and shift in our use of Lexis over the lifespan. So that's something that's really unique to the level of Lexis, I think. Most of my variants or variables that I look at, and the variants that I look at are recessive as opposed to more innovative, which is sort of the opposite way around compared to most sociolinguists who tend to love to study innovation, whereas I'm studying sort of dialect death, you may want to say. But yeah, I think, you know, looking at new variables is really interesting, and looking at how that process happens. You know, how is it that we agree upon terminology for a new concept? And I don't think we know enough about that at the moment.
Yeah, one of the things I just want to pick up on, something, well, that Rhys said and Mary said, and that just made me think, and I thought was very interesting, because when Mary was talking about computer and the various signing that everybody had for computer, it made me think of the use of technical language in many different other languages. So I mean, for example, I'm a translator and an interpreter, and what happens with technology a lot of the time, then it just gets borrowed from English, because that's the main language of communication. And so actually you get a reduction in variation, like in interlingual variation, because they're concepts that didn't exist, and then they're just borrowed from a lingua franca. And so it's an interesting, and there's sort of impoverishment, I guess, of language. And then you get the various languages that try to create like new words for technology. So but yes, I mean, I don't know how to really follow what we said about the lexical variation in that way, but I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
And more interesting with the sign language aspect, I think looking at the lexical item, or considering Lexis, I want to make an observation that some of the signers were actually married couples, but they were depicting one thing differently. And there was no confusion whatsoever that I don't understand your sign. And that leads me to my discussion on the iconicity parameter for the sign modality, that we want to be as iconic as possible. We want to be as informative as possible. Or even the sign for computer, as we said, it is quite novel in this sign language. So whereas other items have community construer, or the way the entire community think about scissors, using the two hands either in the neutral space or the head or as figure ground, or something like computer, everybody has a different idea. It's like showing a blind man an elephant. If he holds the tail, an elephant is just a long tail. If the other one holds the leg, an elephant. So for me, that is how Lexis plays out in deaf community. The iconic aspects the signers hold on to is what they present. So for example, if the signer is interested in fridge as giving water, he will sign fridge as drinking water. If the signer is interested in fridge as something that we can open and put something in, then fridge is an open door. If fridge is something that has cold as a resemblance mapping, so fridge is cold. Another signer can also decide to lump all these three network of associations together. So that signer will say, my sign for fridge, my Lexis for fridge is open door, cold, and it has trace and shape. So though the modality is quite similar in many regards, when we come to sign language, we see different interplay of form meaning mapping leading to different lexis or lexical items in the sign domain. And surprisingly, signers have not complained that your sign language is different, so I don't understand, or the name for the item you've chosen is different. Form meaning resemblance mapping plays so much of a role that irrespective of what is used, there is form of convergence. Signers do understand each other. So it's either you show a bird by the wing, or a bird by the beak, signers know you are talking about a bird, whether in motion, in flight, or sleeping.
Okay, thank you so much. We are running towards the end of our event. I will just pass the floor to Susan, who really is the host of hosts here. As a president of the Philological Society, I want to thank Susan and also Professor Aditi, who was a previous president, for agreeing, allowing Sussex to host this event. We enjoyed it very much. I hope that the Philological Society community also enjoyed being virtually at Sussex. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Sussex. This has been a really fascinating afternoon of talks, 3 very different, but I mean, extremely consonant, I think, talks. And we've learned a great deal, I think, from the discussion and the amplification that each of you has provided on your topics. So it just remains for me to thank everybody for coming. I think it's been really stimulating, and I think what a good opening to what will hopefully be a good weekend. Just to let you know that our next meeting will be in January, where we will have Patricia de Bernardo Stempos talking about reconstructing the accents of Old Celtic, stressed without accent marks. So a varied feast indeed for the Philological Society for the next, for the remainder of the academic year. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And I hope to see you at another Philological Society meeting soon. Thank you very much.